Hello, and welcome to the AXMA Global webinar on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, introduction and real-life application. My name is Andrew Rufner, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. Before we head into the webinar itself, just a couple of housekeeping messages. As you know, you've been muted on this call, so we can maintain the quality of the broadcast. I would like to want to note that this webinar client has got a question section. So if throughout the presentation you have any questions you would like to ask, because we've got a Q&A session at the end, I would like to ask you to post those right away, and then we will try to answer as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make this recording available within the next 24 hours. And finally, as this is part of a webinar series, I would like to invite you to follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter for new webinar announcements over the next coming weeks. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Josh Williams, who is one of the co-founders of SentryWire and a industry expert. And Josh has also been heavily involved with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, so this should definitely be a very interesting presentation. With this, I would like to take the opportunity to hand it over to Josh. Josh, please, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. As Andrew indicated, I'm Josh Williams, and have a history in the U.S. federal government and a career that spans that public sector and private sector, almost all of it focused around intelligence or security. So let's get into an introduction of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. MITRE is a not-for-profit organization that does research and development around a multitude of domains, including technology and what's the emerging cyber practice. And they have developed a set of techniques, activities that are based on unauthorized access by adversaries. And we've got initially involved in it about 6 years ago. We're aware of the methodologies. In fact, one of their methodologies was, we think, informed the development of this framework. I participated in a methodology that sought to identify specific attributes to what are called all hazards incidents. And what the ATT&CK framework has done is similar to that earlier effort. It's used all of the information available about unauthorized access, breaches, cyber attacks, insider threat activities, any incident where the confidentiality, integrity, or the availability of the information or the systems was violated. And it essentially leverages real-world examples that are documented and some even some air gap networks that may not be as highly documented, but they were able to get the information and they have put it into a framework that's well organized, has an API that can be used and is located at the link that you see at the bottom of this slide. So let's talk a little more about the framework and its development. If you're familiar with the what's called the kill chain or the attack life cycle, this adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge, it's an acronym actually, and again it stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge, and it really focuses on the latter half of that life cycle, of the attack life cycle, and it's separate.
Yep, sorry about that, little technical glitch. In any event, I trust my audio is sufficient. I've had to re-engage on the computer, but I believe I dropped around describing the 11 tactics that the MITRE researchers and analysts focused on. That was to the right of the attack lifecycle. And so understand as you learn and familiarize yourself with the framework that there are 283 techniques. About 223 of them are unique. There's about 60 some that are spread across different tactics, but they all serve to reduce the noise of what enterprises are monitoring and collecting, and get right to the specific actions that adversaries take to gain unauthorized access. So if you look at the 11 tactics that are spread across the top, you see that they go from the initial access, so gaining access, unauthorized access, to a device that may be on the perimeter or exposed to the public internet, and then downloading or executing their malicious code that allows them to conduct the rest of these tactics. And there are multiple techniques that can be used to successfully execute each of these 11 tactics. So really what it is for security practitioners is a way to monitor and focus your monitoring and detection effort on these discrete activities. The framework covers all of the operating systems in use in enterprises, and also includes the two major mobile operating systems. You can search and interrogate the knowledge base, the framework's knowledge base, by operating system, or in its entirety if you're looking at a specific behavior. The interface describes what the technique is, how it's categorized, which tactic does this help, is this used to accomplish, but it also provides the data sources that practitioners or those responsible for the security or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system or the network. It provides a list of those data sources. One quick note, these techniques that are listed in the framework do not really include any techniques that these emerging sort of sideband, side channel techniques, like using laser or hyperspectral sensors to determine electromagnetic or heat fluctuations in processing chips. These are the actual fingers on keyboard or malware, or fileless malware crafted techniques. So having covered that, having covered the fact that the framework itself is exposed to the internet, allows for searching on data sources. For instance, one of these techniques is port knocking, which is a technique used to successfully accomplish one of these tactics in the attack lifecycle. And for port knocking, you need the enterprise needs to be able to have something that monitors net flow and captures the packets to identify those errant packets that actually make up the port knocking technique. So some of these tactics will also, your data sources for, hey, we're monitoring, we're looking at this activity, we're doing log correlation. Some of these techniques will be the data sources will only come from the endpoint itself, or it will only come from a specific type of log. And so as I go through the implementation slide, you'll note that I've said that you need to learn the framework as you're conducting your familiarization or analysis of the framework. So that's a little bit about the framework, and at a very high level, a description of the 223 techniques that appear 283 times in the 11 tactics. And so let's talk about implementation, what we've seen as organizations are implementing the framework in some way. We've observed several public sector and a handful of private sector organizations, and we've helped implement it in several cases with some of our vendor partners. So we make some things, and one of the things we make is a packet capture and NetFlow appliance, and we partner with other vendors or other solution makers in the market. And so we've helped those other solutions orient their offering around or enable the attack framework in their tools. And the bottom line is that it really has to be a step-by-step approach. And it starts with learning the framework, familiarizing it. And that can be done obviously collectively, but if you just take 15 and 30-minute blocks of time to have your team conduct an analysis, present the results, it will help you close the skills gap. We've seen it. We've integrated it into our cybersecurity apprenticeship program. Those types of apprenticeships are very rare in the States. And we have one of the first cybersecurity apprenticeship programs in this country. And I can tell you that the attack framework is instrumental in giving the federal and state and all the approvals that we got for our apprenticeship program, because frankly it works. You can use this framework to break down and really educate and continue the professional education of almost any security practitioner at any level. The other thing that the framework is useful for is it helps you identify your detection gaps. Most enterprises have some tool or tools that seeks to detect anomalous or potentially malicious behavior in their environment, stuff that they're monitoring. Using the framework and going through all the data sources will force organizations to get a handle on their asset inventory, their topology, their architecture, and then the tools they use to conduct that detection, and in some cases even the remediation and mitigation. So you can identify, using the framework, all the different data sources that are available for you and your enterprise to monitor, whether it's a Splunk or ELSA or ELK or log correlation, whether it's a SIM-like tool, even vulnerability scanning tools can be used to identify and detect techniques as they occur on networks. And then it forces you, as you do a heat map, and let me go back up to what you looked at on the previous slide, which is really one of our working documents. I blew up the initial access execution, the tactics, so that they could be read. But underneath that blown up description of the tactics is a heat map that we use for integrating our packet capture and NetFlow appliance with other tools. And so as you go through that heat mapping exercise to identify the tools you have that can detect, well, this technique is happening, and it can be detected by looking at the Windows event viewer and looking for this entry, or this technique is evidenced by a port knocking and a privilege escalation. As you start to become familiar with the framework, you can identify where your gaps for detection are. And then the heat map itself, if you layer on some threat intelligence, if you subscribe to threat intelligence, you can research. It's freely available. All the public research on nation state teams that are known threat actors that use these techniques, and you can layer on a heat map of, well, we've seen this, the APT 29 or whatever the name of the group is, and that will help you prioritize closing your detection gaps based on again going through the framework. And then it'll be a vehicle for you to identify and fix any of those internal, back office, home office functions, like your governance, what's our, we have this tool, it's not being, we're using it to detect, but then what does it inform in our change or revision control boards, or what's our patch and vulnerability management? How do we respond to a critical vulnerability that we've identified and that this adversarial actor group uses? So that's the benefits of taking a step-by-step approach. And really, I think there are very few organizations that can boil the ocean. And so that just underscores the fact that, you do it one step at a time. And then the other aspect of implementation that we've determined is vital is to put on your educator's hat, advocacy hat, both internally and externally, to to get buy-in at your senior executive leadership level, and then to participate in the emerging community of interest. I mentioned to you that we have several vendor partners who are, orienting their solution around the attack framework, doing it with us or in conjunction with us. There are often opportunities at trade shows or conferences to present. And as your organization, if you decide this is compelling and this meets your need and you start to go down this path, by all means, connect with me. I mean, if you want to. But I can help with that. We can help you participate in the emerging community of interest. And, you might even sign you up for conducting a webinar like this. So the subject I'd like to cover right now, I just want you to imagine a couple of things. Obviously, we're not going to get into specific detail, but I want you to imagine the U.S. government and the people that we have working who need to have access to our sensitive and classified secret information. And we ask those people, the government, the U.S. government asks those people to provide all the negative information in their life that could be used to blackmail them or somehow cause them to provide, leak that information. And I think most of you may have heard about the fact that we collected all that information. Hey, fill out this form that tells us, all the embarrassing and difficult situations in your life and your family's life that could leave you susceptible to blackmail. And we collected all that and put it into a repository and decided to store it in the U.S. government's Human Resources Department, where, as you can imagine, a lot of people were interested in that information, whether it was from a rather innocuous desire to learn more about the people they're dealing with, or all the way to the furthest edge of what we call counterintelligence. And so that repository of information, representing some 22 million people and 5 million biometric data artifacts, was stolen unauthorized access was gained to it. It was bundled up and exfiltrated out by a nation state actor. And this happened in, well, it was announced in 2014 that breach had happened. And as you can imagine, there was a great deal of interest in figuring out what happened and trying to make it so that it couldn't happen again. And so we participated in an incident response where, again, you can imagine the different techniques that we talked about in this framework. And we essentially were able to layer on, do that fusion. You know, I talked about using the heat map fusion, where you do a heat map of, you lay out what data sources you're currently monitoring, and then maybe fuse on threat intelligence about the techniques that adversarial actors are using and identify the gaps and close those gaps. Well, the same thing could be used, that same approach of fusing data sources. You can do it with data sources. So you can fuse the log correlation and aggregation data sources and fuse it with net flow and packet capture. And then when people who are responding to the incident see that activity has happened based on the net flow and the packet capture that isn't reflected in the log correlation and aggregation, then that would be of immense interest to the people trying to protect the network. And so you can imagine something like that happened, but we do know that this nation state actor, his name is Yuping, wrote the Sacula rat that was used to gain unauthorized access to those 22 million records in the government's HR department. And we were able to provide some level of attribution or fusion so that we could hone in on this person. And this person, under sealed indictment, was arrested in August, actually, of 2017. And the indictment was recently unsealed. But that is probably the highest visibility, real-world example that we could imagine the attack framework would have been useful to accomplish. So at this point, I'm going to take a pause and see if there are any questions.
So thank you very much, Josh. This was very insightful and helpful. One question was on the slide where you showed the actual attack framework. On the graph that you had at the bottom, there were different colors, what those colors represent. So maybe if you could go back to that slide and just talk to that briefly.
Sure. So these were internal colors that I actually used one of our working documents. It was an Excel spreadsheet. And so these colors represented where enterprise network packet capture, which is where you're taking a full duplex tap. You're getting a copy of all the traffic. You're not in line. You're just taking a copy of the traffic. And net flow, which is where you're looking at the various sessions and connecting them logically by some identifier. We happen to use IPFix, but it doesn't matter. These colors reflect the different techniques that either we can provide authoritative response to, or in some instrumentation or integration with a technology partner, we can provide insight into, or through the fusion method, where you don't even really need instrumentation. You just need the Splunk or ELK or ELSA log data and NetFlow, or a battlefield deception tool. And so these colors are, I literally used one of our documents. This has nothing to do with MITRE. This is our analysis and heat mapping and fusion of those techniques. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. One other question, or actually two questions that are probably somewhat related, are the following. So one, is you refer to understanding the infrastructure that you have as a basis for the implementation. And the question really is, what would I need to know as a minimum, and what would you consider to be minimal components of a security infrastructure? Do I need a firewall? What else do I need? And then there was a second question, but just somewhat related to that, I guess, is does the implementation of this framework actually mean a rip and replace in terms of infrastructure or not?
Okay, so let me answer the first one, the last one first. So there is no rip and replace required. This framework is really intended to leverage what's already in place. Now, we occasionally run across networks that are wide open. They're usually in smaller organizations. Although I guess you could say the HR department of the U.S. government back in 2012, 13, and 14 could have fit into that category. But most enterprises have a segmentation approach whereby you have different parts of the network that have less monitoring and less security control implementation on them, until you get to increasingly more restrictive segments where, say, the very sensitive information or identity information is kept. So that we definitely need segmentation, and we definitely need some sort of firewall mechanism, something that that catches potentially malicious traffic headed for potentially vulnerable hosts. I mean, we need that as well. And then you obviously need identity and access management, some sort of solution that that enforces, we know who you are and you're able to have this access and this functionality. Those are the three basics that are needed. And there's many different variations. I know this is about the attack framework, but I definitely encourage every organization that has a network on it to review the 802.1 AQAH. That's 802.1 AQAH. It's intermediate system to intermediate system protocol, and it's basically shortest path bridging, and it just takes so much off the attack surface. But irrespective of what type of network you have, you should have those three components to it, and then you should have a way of monitoring. And then most organizations have some level of compliance they want to meet, whether it's with a commercial or whether they're statutorily regulate some policy that they have to comply with. And so there should be a way of measuring that compliance as well. And whatever those tools are, this framework can be used with those tools. There's no rip and replace. It really focuses the security posture efforts of an organization. Did that answer that question, Andrew?
Yeah, thank you very much. We have one other question here related to frameworks. So one question is, I hear people talk about ISO 17799, or as it is known these days, 27002. How am I supposed to understand the ISO framework versus the MITRE ATT&CK framework?
Okay, well, the risk management framework, so the ISO framework is a risk management framework that focuses on cost-effective risk reduction. So it encompasses a series of controls. They're either technical, meaning, hey, this technology device should have these ports turned off and you should use hard passwords that change every 12 days. Those are the technical controls. The operational controls, hey, you need to make sure you've got guns, gates, guards, and gadgets around your data centers. And then the management controls. You need to have a procedure that's traced to a policy that spells out what you do in incident or patch and vulnerability management. And so that's the ISO framework. It's more about, it's a risk management framework. The attack framework is solely 100% focused on adversaries that are seeking to defeat that risk management framework. So you see how they work together? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it definitely. So I mean, the ISO framework, I guess what you're saying is a broader framework that definitely helps organizations put together their entire processes and policies around broader security measures. And then the attack framework is really focused on the adversaries, as you say, right?
You said it so much better than me, so that's perfect, Andrew.
Thank you. We have one question here also that relates to, I guess, more of a technology component. So the question here is, whether you could explain the IDS/IPS feedback loop and how that potentially ties in with packet capture that you mentioned earlier on.
Well, okay. So intrusion detection and intrusion prevention is essentially the discipline, the set of activities and the tools and the techniques and procedures around detecting and identifying intrusion attempts from all the noise that's on the network, on the internet, or in air gap systems. So all the noise includes regular machine-to-machine talking, domain name service, border gateway, depending on where you are on the network. So it's our TCP/IP version 4, even version 6 is very chatty. There's a lot of, hey, you, this is me going on, and some heartbeats. And so a lot of the network traffic that's generated is that kind of noisy chatterness, and it's what intruders and adversaries use to mask their attempts to gain unauthorized access. And so the traditional intrusion detection and prevention tools that are out there are focused on that: identifying, detecting, alerting a human being, or depending on the instrumentation and integration, quarantining that potentially anomalous or malicious traffic that's trying to fit in under the noisy chatter of the network. So packet capture and net flow is very complementary. You can use Snort or Suricata. Those are easy to research. They're very understandable tools and query languages and signature, and marry that up with net flow and packet capture. In other words, have those signatures alert or notify somebody based on a timestamp or other network attribute, and then you're essentially doing correlation and fusion, so that this could have been an intrusion attempt, and then you can go and see the traffic and say, oh no, that was message queuing, and it looked like it, but it wasn't. And that's essentially what you do with SIMs, with IDS, with any tool that seeks to identify potentially malicious or anomalous activity on your network can be complemented by having an authoritative copy of of that actual traffic, right? Make sense?
Thank you, Josh. I have another question, which I'm not quite sure how to understand it, but I think it relates back to the points you made on the ISO and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And the question really is whether this is sort of similar to the .govCAR initiative, which I'm not aware of, but you might maybe.
So ask it again, Andrew. I didn't hear it. GovCAR?
The question was related to the points that you made on the ISO and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And one of the questions is whether this is in some way related to the .govCAR initiative.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
.govCAR?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess what we'll do is we'll research that, and then we'll put the questions and answers up when we post the webinar. So if we can actually find out an answer to that, we will post that. There was one more on technology where I think you've already answered. There is one which is a little bit longer, but I'll ask it quickly anyway. You were talking about the need for the right technology, process, and skills to operate a security operation efficiently. The biggest challenge for a mid-sized organization is to establish an initial level of maturity. Any recommendations on where to start? We just find it difficult to establish what is the base infrastructure and skills just to get started, and which parts of the framework we should look at first. Any suggestions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't know who wrote that question or who asked that question, but yeah, I think that's these are foundational. To have a good foundation, to have a security posture, you have to know the assets. You have to know what's inside the boundary. What are you responsible for? And that, by operating system, by platform, and then layer in the criticality, and that requires interaction with the business. You have to know something about the business or the organization to determine criticality. And then we generally layer on criticality, and we factor in criticality for the assets. So if some organizations have a very healthy and accurate configuration management database, and there's an asset inventory in there. If not, that's a challenge to get an asset inventory together. And then you can layer on the criticality of those assets. Obviously, some assets are less critical than others. They all have a degree of criticality because they're interconnectedness, right? But you have to factor in the criticality so that you're spending your time and your energy and your resources wisely. You're not just putting all your energy towards an information kiosk in the front of your building, right? And then you should have an idea of the threat landscape and threat intelligence and intelligence sharing is readily available all over the internet. There's information sharing and analysis organizations that absolutely identify using a common vulnerability enumeration, a common platform enumeration, and those data exist and they're easily accessible. So you want to know about the threat. And then once you've got a handle on the assets and the threats simultaneously as a concurrent work stream, you need to look at the vulnerabilities that exist and understand that whether or not those vulnerabilities apply. And that is a non-trivial task because of the huge number of vulnerabilities that exist. Again, the common vulnerability enumeration exists, and it's the same no matter what language or what country you're in. If you're using this version of Microsoft, or you have this type of router, or you have this type of network device manufactured by this manufacturer, there is a collection of an exhaustive collection, some would argue, of all those vulnerabilities. Now, there's zero-day vulnerabilities associated with every single device, it's a vulnerability that wasn't listed in the common vulnerability enumeration. And obviously those are the most dangerous. Although recent high-profile breaches can be traced back to vulnerabilities that have been known for years. And I'm not trying to strike a self-righteous condemning tone in this, because this is a challenging inflection point that we find ourselves in. But security practitioners, network managers, people responsible for their information or systems or identities, they have to educate themselves, and they have to be aware of what they're charged with protecting. And so the assets, what's in play, what's the threat look like out there, and the vulnerabilities are the three foundational components to any risk management framework. And then the attack framework allows you to even narrow your focus more to looking at indicators or techniques that adversaries use. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much, Josh. And then I think we got one final question, at least from the questions that I've got listed, and that's related more to SentryWire. So it seems somebody's done some homework on SentryWire. And the question there is really, what, if any, attack vectors that the SentryWire platform itself helps you address?
Okay, well, SentryWire is we take a full duplex tap, a test access port, bidirectional. Essentially, we want a copy of all the traffic, even the sessionless traffic, the ICMP, the UDP. So we take a copy of that traffic, and we store it. And most people have probably used Wireshark. I don't know about most people, but maybe some other people on this webinar have used Wireshark, and that is essentially what SentryWire is. And then we've bolted on, we haven't bolted on, we've integrated, we do at line rate, the net flow analysis using IP fix. So really any of these techniques that traverse the network, packet capture and net flow, were useful in detecting, identifying and detecting. Because we're a full duplex tap, and there's a whole bunch of other enterprise packet capture and solutions on the market, and you know, they all have this limitation that you're just taking a copy of the traffic. You're not really in line. And so those tools have to be instrumented with other tools or other mechanisms. Like we integrate with all the next-gen firewalls so that when we identify potentially malicious traffic headed for a potentially vulnerable host, we can fire something off of our management interfaces, right? The capture interfaces in promiscuous mode, which you're taking a copy of the traffic. And then at the other end, you got management interfaces, which say to somebody, hey, this anomalous behavior is detected. Or if it matches a certain set of criteria, hey, this behavior is noted and confirmed, and we need to quarantine it using, you know, your next-gen firewall of choice, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, Fortinet. And that's really how we fit. We complement whatever you have for packet capture, whether you know, whatever your ability to have that capture timeline, that's essentially the way that you go into an environment, is that you're complementary with all the other tools. None of these tools, none of our vendor partners, at least the ones we work with, are ever going to let sales and marketing, you know, say that, oh, we're, you know, we solve all your problems. You'll be, you know, you won't be vulnerable if you buy. That is not the case, and we know that. And the people that we work with, I'm glad to share some of those names as well. Particularly, I just want to say, we have some partners that absolutely embrace that, and we have to work. We have to instrument or integrate with each other to you know, cost effectively reduce the risk for the practitioners that have purchased our tools. So there, any one of those techniques that it focuses or that is like network centric, we can absolutely complement. And those that are based on, you know, what's inside the endpoint, we instrument with plenty of endpoint solutions. We have a great relationship with a couple of them, and we have an API, and so we'll take an attribute about what's going on with that endpoint, and we'll sessionize all around that attribute, whether it's a timestamp or a MAC address, and we'll see what else is going on. So that's really the bottom line when you implement packet capture and NetFlow.
So Josh, maybe to just try and summarize, make sure I understood this correctly. So what you're saying is that packet capture is one additional component of your security infrastructure. The benefit of it being that it provides you an authoritative data